The smell of rosemary chicken filled the entire house as I pulled the roasting pan from the oven. Golden skin, perfectly crispy, just the way Marcus liked it. I had spent 3 hours preparing this meal. Homemade dinner rolls, garlic mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, and his favorite chocolate bourbon cake cooling on the counter. It was Tuesday, which meant nothing special to most people. But to me, it had become another opportunity to show my family how much I cared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I wiped my hands on the kitchen towel and glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. 6:30 exactly. Marcus would be home from his accounting firm any minute, and Sophia would emerge from her room where she'd been video chatting with friends since getting home from her senior year of high school. This dinner, like so many others, was my way of bringing us together around the table, creating those precious family moments that I'd always treasured. At 52, I had devoted the last 25 years of my life to making our house in Millbrook Heights feel like a true home. Every morning, I woke up thinking about what would make Marcus and Sophia happy. Every evening, I planned meals that would nourish not just their bodies, but hopefully spark conversation and connection. I genuinely believed that if I just tried hard enough, loved deeply enough, and gave generously enough, I could create the family bond I had always dreamed of. The front door clicked open, and I heard Marcus drop his briefcase in the entryway with that familiar thud. His footsteps moved directly past the kitchen toward the living room. I waited for him to notice the aroma, to peek his head in and ask about dinner, to maybe even compliment the effort I'd put in. Instead, I heard the television switch on, the volume climbing louder than necessary. "Dinner's ready," I called out, arranging the chicken on the serving platter with extra care. I had even used our good china, the set we'd received as a wedding gift that rarely saw daylight except for holidays and special occasions. Tonight felt like it deserved something special, though I couldn't have explained why. Sophia's bedroom door remained closed. The muffled sound of her laughter carried down the stairs as she continued her video call. I climbed the steps and knocked gently. "Sweetie, dinner's on the table." "I'm not hungry," came her response through the door. "Besides, I'm talking to Madison about prom dresses." "This is important, Mom." I stood there for a moment, my hand still raised near the door. Prom was still 2 months away, and we had already discussed dress shopping multiple times, but I didn't argue. I never argued. Instead, I smiled to myself and headed back downstairs, thinking that maybe Marcus and I could have a quiet dinner together for once. In the living room, Marcus had settled into his leather recliner with a beer in hand. The local news droned on about city council meetings and traffic updates. He looked comfortable, relaxed, like a man who had finally reached his sanctuary after a long day. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, still wearing my apron, still smiling. "Honey, I made your favorite chicken recipe. Would you like to eat in the dining room, or should I bring you a plate?" He glanced at me briefly, then back at the television screen. "Just bring me a plate, Helen. This segment about the new tax legislation affects my clients. I need to pay attention." I nodded, understanding completely. Marcus worked hard to provide for our family. His accounting practice had grown steadily over the years, and I was proud of his dedication. If he needed to eat while staying informed about work matters, I could certainly accommodate that. I prepared his plate with extra care, making sure to include the crispiest piece of chicken and a generous helping of the potatoes he loved. When I returned to the living room, he accepted the plate with a distracted thanks, but never took his eyes off the screen. I lingered for a moment, hoping he might comment on the meal or ask about my day, but the television seemed to hold his complete attention. The news had moved on to sports highlights, then weather, then some celebrity gossip segment that made him chuckle. Back in the kitchen, I prepared my own plate and stood at the counter, eating while looking out the window at our backyard. The garden I had planted last spring was dormant now in the February cold, but I could still see the neat rows where tomatoes and herbs would grow again. I had always found peace in that view, in the promise of new growth and the satisfaction of nurturing something beautiful. This had become our routine over the past several months. I would cook, call everyone to dinner, then end up eating alone while they pursued their own interests. At first I told myself it was just a phase. Sophia was busy with her senior year activities, and Marcus was dealing with tax season stress. Soon things would return to normal, and we'd be back to our family dinners filled with conversation and laughter. But as I stood there that Tuesday evening, mechanically chewing my perfectly seasoned chicken, I began to wonder when normal had shifted. When had we stopped eating together? When had I become the invisible woman who prepared meals that were consumed without acknowledgement or appreciation? When had my family decided that my company was optional? I finished my dinner in silence, then began the familiar ritual of cleaning up, loading the dishwasher, wrapping leftovers, wiping down the counters until they gleamed. From the living room, I could hear Marcus channel surfing, the sound of different programs blending together as he searched for something more interesting than his wife's carefully prepared meal. Sophia never did come downstairs that evening. Around 8 o'clock I took a plate up to her room and left it outside her door with a note saying the cake was in the kitchen. If she wanted dessert later, the plate would still be there, untouched when I went to bed. As I prepared for sleep that night, I lay in bed listening to Marcus brush his teeth in the bathroom. When he climbed into bed beside me, I thought about mentioning how much effort I had put into dinner, how I had hoped we could spend some time together as a family. But he was already reaching for his phone, scrolling through emails and news articles with the blue light illuminating his face in the darkness. "Marcus," I said softly, "do you think we could try to eat dinner together tomorrow? Maybe we could talk Sophia into joining us." He made a non-committal humming sound, still focused on his screen. "We'll see. I might have to work late tomorrow. Henderson's books are a mess," and I promised him I'd sort through his quarterly reports. I nodded in the darkness, even though he couldn't see me. "Of course. Work comes first. Helen, you know how important this business is to our future. I'm trying to build something here that will set us up for retirement. Maybe help pay for Sophia's college." He was right. Of course, Marcus had always been responsible about our financial future. His steady income had allowed me to focus on creating a comfortable home, without the stress of needing a career outside these walls. I should have been grateful. I was grateful. But lying there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, I had become a supporting character in my own life. The next morning brought the same routine. I woke before anyone else, started the coffee, and began preparing breakfast. Sophia rushed through the kitchen grabbing a granola bar and her backpack, mumbling something about a study group meeting before first period. Marcus poured his coffee into a travel mug and kissed my cheek absently before heading out to beat the morning traffic. I spent that Wednesday like I spent most of my days. I went grocery shopping, selecting ingredients for meals I hoped would bring my family pleasure. I organized closets, did laundry, and made sure every corner of our house reflected the love and care I put into maintaining our home. I called my sister Linda in Phoenix, who listened patiently as I described my latest attempts to create perfect family moments. "Helen, honey," Linda said gently, "when was the last time Marcus asked you what you wanted for dinner? When was the last time Sophia helped you cook or even thanked you for taking care of her laundry?" I found myself making excuses. Sophia was 17, and naturally focused on her own social world. Marcus carried the financial burden of our household and deserved to relax when he came home. These were normal family dynamics, weren't they? Everyone went through phases where daily routines overshadowed deeper connection. But that evening, as I prepared another elaborate meal that would likely be consumed in separate rooms while I ate alone at the kitchen counter, Linda's questions echoed in my mind. When had I stopped being a person with preferences and become simply the woman who made sure everyone else's needs were met? Thursday brought a small variation to our routine. Marcus came home with news that his firm was expanding, potentially adding 2 new junior accountants. This could mean more income, possibly enough to start planning that European vacation we had talked about for years. I felt genuinely excited for him, proud of his success, and eager to celebrate this good news together. I prepared his favorite meal, beef stroganoff with egg noodles, and set the dining room table with candles and our wedding china. When he arrived home, I greeted him with enthusiasm about his business growth and gestured toward the special dinner I had arranged. "This looks nice, Helen." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "But I'm exhausted. Can we just eat in front of the TV tonight? There's a documentary about financial planning strategies that I wanted to watch." I stood there holding the bottle of wine I had selected to accompany our celebration dinner. The candles flickered on the table that would remain empty once again. "Of course," I said, blowing out the candles. "I'll bring our plates to the living room." As I served him his dinner on a tray table next to his recliner, Marcus launched into a detailed explanation of his expansion plan. He spoke with genuine excitement about hiring timelines, office space, and projected revenue increases. I listened intently, asking questions and offering encouragement, but I noticed that his enthusiasm was entirely focused on the business implications. At no point did he mention what this success might mean for us as a couple, or how we might celebrate this milestone together. I ate my stroganoff while standing in the kitchen doorway, watching him enjoy his meal while simultaneously absorbing information from his documentary. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally on the outside looking in at my own celebration dinner. That night I found myself pulling out our wedding album from the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser. 25 years ago, Marcus and I had promised to build a life together based on love, partnership, and mutual respect. In the photos I could see the hope and excitement we both felt about our future. We had talked about growing old together, traveling, creating traditions that would bind our family across generations. Looking at those images of our younger selves, I tried to identify the exact moment when I had transitioned from being Marcus's partner to being his household manager. When had my dreams become secondary to his career goals? When had my contributions become invisible background work that enabled everyone else's lives to run smoothly? Friday evening, I made a decision that felt both small and monumentally significant. Instead of preparing an elaborate dinner, I made a simple meal of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Instead of calling everyone to the table, I set one place setting for myself in the dining room. I lit a single candle, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat down to eat alone with intention rather than by default. When Marcus came home and found me seated at the dining room table, he seemed genuinely confused. "Where's dinner?" he asked, looking around as if expecting to find his usual tray waiting in the living room. "I made grilled cheese sandwiches," I said calmly. "There are 2 in the kitchen if you'd like them." "Grilled cheese? Helen, I've been working all day." I was hoping for something more substantial. I took a sip of my wine and looked directly at him. "There's also soup, and lunch meat if you prefer a sandwich." Something in my tone must have registered as different, because Marcus studied my face more carefully than he had in months. "Are you feeling okay? You seem different tonight." "I'm feeling fine," I replied. "I'm just tired of eating alone every night while preparing meals that no one seems to notice or appreciate." Marcus sat down across from me, still looking puzzled. "Helen, I appreciate everything you do. You know that. I just prefer to relax and watch TV after work. It helps me unwind." "When was the last time you asked me how I spent my day?" I asked quietly. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, clearly searching his memory. The silence stretched between us until it became uncomfortable. "When was the last time you thanked me for cooking dinner or doing your laundry or managing our social calendar?" I continued. "I thank you," he said defensively. "I always thank you." "When?" Another long pause. "Helen, I don't understand what's brought this on. We've been married for 25 years. I thought we were happy." I finished my wine and looked at him across the table. The candlelight cast shadows on his face, making him look older than I usually noticed. "Marcus, are you happy?" "Of course I'm happy. I have a successful business, a beautiful home, a wonderful family. And what makes you think I'm happy?" He blinked several times, as if the question had never occurred to him. "Well, you seem content. You like taking care of the house, cooking, managing. That's what you've always done. What I've always done and what makes me happy might not be the same thing. That conversation marked the beginning of what I would later think of as my awakening. Not a dramatic revelation, but a gradual recognition that I had spent so many years focused on everyone else's happiness that I had forgotten to consider my own. I had become so skilled at anticipating their needs that I had stopped recognizing my own. Over the next few days, I began paying attention to the small interactions that had become automatic. Marcus handing me his dirty coffee cup without looking at me, expecting me to wash it. Sophia dropping her backpack in the entryway, knowing I would move it to its proper place. Both of them discussing weekend plans that involved their own interests, without considering whether I might have preferences about how we spent our time together. I started an experiment. Instead of immediately cleaning up after them, I left Marcus's coffee cup on the counter where he placed. Instead of moving Sophia's backpack, I let it sit in the entryway. Instead of preparing elaborate dinners, I made simple meals and announced them once before eating alone if no one responded. The changes were subtle but the reactions were swift. Marcus began asking why the house seemed messier and why dinner had become so basic. Sophia complained that she couldn't find her favorite sweater and wanted to know why I hadn't done laundry as frequently as usual. I've been busy, I told them, which was true. I had started spending time on activities that interested me rather than solely focusing on household management. I had enrolled in a pottery class at the community center, begun reading novels instead of just cooking magazines, and started taking long walks in the park where I could think without interruption. These small acts of self-preservation felt revolutionary. For the first time in years, I was doing things simply because they brought me pleasure, not because they served someone else's needs. The pottery class was particularly liberating. My hands shaped clay into imperfect bowls and crooked vases that belonged to no one but me. The instructor, a woman named Carol who had started pottery after her own divorce, understood the therapeutic value of creating something beautiful with your own hands. There's something powerful about making something that's entirely yours, Carol told our small class one evening. When you spend years taking care of everyone else, you forget that you're capable of creating beauty for its own sake. Her words resonated deeply with me. When had I stopped creating anything that was purely mine? When had all my energy become focused on maintenance rather than creation? Even my garden, which I loved, was primarily focused on providing fresh herbs and vegetables for family meals, rather than simply enjoying the beauty of growing things. That realization led me to make another small but significant change. I started a flower garden in the corner of our backyard, planting bulbs that would bloom in bright colors, serving no purpose except to bring me joy. When Marcus asked why I was wasting space on decorative plants when I could grow more vegetables, I simply said, because I like flowers. The simplicity of that answer seemed to confuse him. He kept asking follow-up questions, as if there must be some practical justification for my choice that he was missing, but there wasn't. I liked flowers, I wanted to see them bloom, I wanted to cut fresh bouquets for my own enjoyment. For the first time in years that felt like reason enough. As winter began to fade into early spring, I found myself observing my family with new clarity. Marcus came home each evening, and immediately claimed the living room as his domain, turning on the television and settling into his recliner as if the rest of the house was simply the supporting infrastructure for his comfort. Sophia moved through our home like a hotel guest, using the amenities without considering who maintained them, or what effort went into making her life comfortable. I began to wonder what our house would look like if I disappeared. Who would remember to pay the utilities, replace the furnace filter, organize Sophia's medical appointments, send birthday cards to Marcus's relatives, or ensure there was food in the refrigerator? The answer was trouble. My family had become so accustomed to my invisible labor that they had no awareness of everything I managed to keep their lives running smoothly. That insight led me to a painful but necessary question. If my family didn't notice or appreciate my daily contributions, would they even notice if I wasn't there to make them? And if they wouldn't notice my absence, what did that say about my value in their lives? I started keeping a notebook, documenting all the tasks I performed in a typical week. The list was staggering. Beyond the obvious cooking and cleaning, I managed Marcus's work wardrobe, ensuring his shirts were pressed and his suits were clean. I tracked Sophia's school schedule, maintained relationships with her teachers, and coordinated her extracurricular activities. I managed our social calendar, remembering birthdays and anniversaries that Marcus had forgotten, organizing gatherings with friends and relatives. I handled all medical appointments, insurance claims, and prescription refills for the entire family. I maintained our cars, remembering oil changes and tire rotations that Marcus considered handled because I took care of them. I managed our household budget, paid bills, and tracked expenses that allowed Marcus to focus entirely on his business income, without worrying about how that money was allocated for daily life. Reading through my notebook, I realized that I had essentially been running a small business dedicated to maintaining the comfort and convenience of two people who had stopped acknowledging my work. If I were an employee, I would have demanded recognition, raises, and perhaps some consideration for the scope of my responsibilities. But as a wife and mother, my labor had somehow become invisible, expected rather than appreciated. The turning point came on a Sunday in early March. I had spent the morning preparing an elaborate brunch, hoping to create a pleasant family meal together: homemade pancakes, fresh fruit, bacon, and the special coffee cake Marcus enjoyed with his weekend newspaper. I set the table carefully, using the good linens and even picking a few early daffodils from my flower garden for a centerpiece. When I called them to brunch, Marcus looked up from his sports section long enough to say, "Can you just bring me a plate? I want to finish reading about the basketball tournament." Sophia, who was painting her nails in the living room, called out, "I'm not really hungry, and I can't eat with wet polish anyway." I stood in the dining room, looking at the beautiful table I had prepared, the food growing cold, the daffodils, bright and cheerful in their small vase, this perfectly prepared meal that no one wanted to share, this effort that no one valued, this gesture of love that went unnoticed. Instead of being hurt or angry, I felt something else entirely, a strange sense of clarity, as if I were seeing my life from a great distance, and finally understanding what I was looking at. I was a woman who had devoted decades to caring for people who had stopped seeing her as a person worth caring about in return. I sat down at the table and ate my brunch alone, savoring every bite. The pancakes were perfectly fluffy, the coffee cake was sweet and tender, and the daffodils filled the room with the promise of spring. It was a lovely meal, and I was excellent company for myself. After I finished eating and cleaned the kitchen, I walked upstairs to our bedroom, and opened the drawer where we kept important documents: marriage certificate, insurance policies, mortgage papers, and there at the bottom, the folder containing our wills and beneficiary and for Marcus's retirement accounts, life insurance policies, and business assets. I pulled out the documents and sat on our bed, reading through the legal language that spelled out how our life together would be concluded if something happened to either of us. Marcus was the primary beneficiary on everything I owned, just as I was listed as his primary beneficiary. Sophia was named as the contingent beneficiary who would inherit everything, if both parents died. These documents reflected the traditional assumption that married couples were partners, who had built their lives together and would want their spouse to benefit from their shared asset. But looking at these papers, I realized they no longer reflected the reality of our relationship. Marcus and Sophia had not built this life with me. They had simply lived in the comfortable environment I had created and maintained for them. If something happened to me tomorrow, Marcus would inherit a house he had never cleaned, bank accounts he had never balanced, and the proceeds from insurance policies he had never bothered to understand. He would benefit financially from the death of a woman whose life he had stopped valuing years ago. The thought was so clear and cold that it took my breath away. I was essentially subsidizing my own invisibility, ensuring that even in death, my primary function would be to make someone else's life more comfortable. I returned the documents to their folder and placed them back in the drawer, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had read. That evening, as I prepared another dinner that would likely be eaten in separate rooms, I found myself wondering about alternatives. What would happen if I changed those beneficiary designations? What if my life insurance and retirement savings went to organizations that actually valued the kind of work I had spent decades doing. The idea felt both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying, because it represented a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that had governed my marriage for 25 years. Liberating, because it suggested that I still had some control over my own story, even if that control could only be exercised posthumously. That night I lay in bed, listening to Marcus snore softly beside me, his face peaceful in sleep. He looked like the man I had fallen in love with, the ambitious young accountant who had promised to build a beautiful life together. But promises, I was learning, required ongoing commitment from both people to remain meaningful. Somewhere along the way, our partnership had become a service arrangement, where I provided domestic labor in exchange for financial security, and even that exchange had become so one-sided that I wasn't sure what I was receiving in return. I thought about the women in my pottery class, many of whom had stories similar to mine. Carol, whose husband had left her for a younger woman after she had supported his medical practice for 30 years. Janet, whose children had grown up and moved away without ever acknowledging the sacrifices she had made for their comfort and success. Maria, whose husband had died suddenly, leaving her to discover that he had been making financial decisions for years without consulting her, assuming she wouldn't understand or care about their economic future. These women had found themselves starting over at an age when they had expected to be enjoying the fruits of their life's work. Instead, they were learning to value themselves for the first time, discovering interests and capabilities they had forgotten they possessed, building new lives from the foundation of their own worth rather than their usefulness to others. I didn't want to wait for a crisis to discover my own value. I didn't want to spend the next 20 years providing unacknowledged service to people who saw me as a convenience rather than a person. And I certainly didn't want to reward that treatment by leaving them financially comfortable after my death, while organizations that actually helped people went without support. The next morning, I made an appointment with an estate planning attorney. I told Marcus I was meeting a friend for lunch, which was true in the sense that I was finally planning to become my own friend. For the first time in years, I was going to make a decision based entirely on what felt right to me, regardless of how it might affect anyone else's comfort or convenience. The attorney's office was downtown in a building I had driven past hundreds of times, but never entered. The waiting room was decorated with plants and comfortable chairs, designed to put people at ease during what were often difficult conversations about mortality and legacy. I sat there thinking about what kind of legacy I wanted to leave, what kind of statement I wanted to make about the life I had lived, and the values I held dear. When the attorney called my name, I stood up feeling more certain than I had about anything in months. I was finally ready to take control of my own story. The attorney's name was Margaret Chen, and she had the kind of calm, professional demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Her office was lined with law books and family photos, suggesting someone who understood both legal complexities and personal relationships. When I explained that I wanted to review and potentially modify my estate planning documents, she nodded as if this were the most natural request in the world. Many people find that their circumstances change over time, Margaret said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. Life insurance beneficiaries, retirement account designations, will provisions, these should all reflect your current wishes and values, not decisions you made decades ago. I found myself explaining more than I had planned. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush as I described the gradual erosion of appreciation and recognition in my marriage. Margaret listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about assets and account structures, but mostly just letting me talk through 25 years of accumulated frustration. Miss Patterson, she said when I finally paused, what you're describing is unfortunately more common than you might think. Many women find themselves in marriages where their contributions become invisible over time. The question is, what do you want your legacy to reflect? I had been thinking about that question for days. I want my life insurance and retirement savings to go to organizations that actually value the kind of work I've spent my life doing. Women's shelters, programs that help people transition out of difficult marriages, maybe some scholarships for women returning to school later in life. Margaret made notes as I spoke. And your husband, your daughter. Marcus has his own retirement accounts and life insurance through his business. He's always been the financial planner in our family, so he'll be fine,
As for Sophia, she's 17 and has never shown any appreciation for what I do. Maybe inheriting less money will teach her to value other people's contributions. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours as we reviewed all my accounts and policies. I discovered that I had more assets in my own name than I had realized. Years of careful household budgeting had allowed me to accumulate a modest but significant retirement fund. The life insurance policy I had maintained through my previous job had grown substantially over the decade.
Combined, these assets represented a considerable inheritance that could make a real difference to charitable organizations. I'll need a few days to draft the necessary paperwork, Margaret said as our meeting concluded. But I want you to be absolutely certain about these changes. Once you sign the new documents, your previous beneficiary designations will be void. I left her office, feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time in years, I was making a decision based entirely on my own values and priorities. No one else's comfort or convenience was factored into my choice. It felt revolutionary. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner of baked salmon and steamed vegetables. When Marcus came home, he barely glanced at the meal before settling into his usual spot in front of the television. I ate at the kitchen counter, watching the news on the small television we kept for cooking shows, and found myself genuinely enjoying the solitude. Over the next few days, I began implementing other small changes that reflected my new perspective. Instead of automatically washing Marcus's coffee cup when he left it on the counter, I left it there until he needed a clean one and had to wash it himself. Instead of immediately picking up Sophia's discarded sweaters and books, I let them accumulate until she couldn't find something she needed. The reactions were predictable. Marcus complained that the house was becoming disorganized and wondered if I was feeling overwhelmed. Sophia accused me of being passive-aggressive when she couldn't find her favorite jeans because I hadn't done laundry on my usual schedule. I'm not being passive-aggressive, I told Sophia calmly. I'm just not automatically cleaning up after you anymore. You're 17 years old, you can manage your own laundry and keep track of your own belongings. She stared at me as if I had suggested something completely unreasonable. But you've always done my laundry. That's what you do. What I've always done and what I'm going to continue doing are two different things, I replied. I'm not your personal maid service, sweetheart. I'm your mother, and it's time you learned to take care of yourself. The conversation with Marcus was more complex. He seemed genuinely confused by my changing behavior, as if he couldn't understand why I was suddenly making issues out of things that had worked fine for years. Helen, I don't understand what's gotten into you lately, he said one evening, after I had declined to iron his shirts for the next day. You seem different, distant. I'm not distant, I said. I'm just not automatically anticipating everyone else's needs anymore. If you need shirts ironed, you can iron them yourself, or take them to the dry cleaner. But you've always taken care of that stuff. It's not like I don't appreciate it. When was the last time you told me you appreciate it? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, searching his memory. The silence stretched between us until it became uncomfortable. That's what I thought, I said quietly. Margaret called the following Friday to let me know the documents were ready for my review. I drove to her office during lunchtime, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The papers were neatly organized in a manila folder, each page clearly marked with colored tabs. My new will designated the bulk of my estate to 3 organizations: a local women's shelter that provided transitional housing and job training, a scholarship fund for women over 40 returning to college, and a nonprofit that offered financial counseling to people leaving difficult marriages. Marcus would receive our house and enough money to maintain it comfortably, but not the windfall he might have expected. Sophia would receive a modest inheritance when she turned 25, along with a letter explaining that the reduced amount was intended to encourage her to develop her own capabilities, rather than relying on unearned wealth. Are you satisfied with these provisions? Margaret asked as I reviewed each page. Yes, I said without hesitation. This feels right. This reflects what I actually value. I signed the documents with a steady hand, feeling like I was finally authoring my own story after years of being a supporting character in someone else's narrative. The beneficiary changes on my life insurance and retirement accounts would take effect immediately. My new will would be filed and stored securely in Margaret's office. Walking back to my car, I felt a strange sense of completion, as if I had finally aligned my legal documents with my actual values and priorities. If something happened to me tomorrow, my legacy would support women who were struggling to find their own voices and independence, rather than simply maintaining the comfort of people who had stopped seeing me as a person worth value. That weekend, I decided to test just how invisible I had become. Instead of preparing my usual elaborate Saturday breakfast, I made coffee and toast for myself and sat at the kitchen table reading a novel I had been enjoying. When Marcus came downstairs expecting to find his usual weekend spread of eggs, bacon, and fresh fruit, he seemed genuinely puzzled. "Where's breakfast?" he asked, looking around the kitchen as if it might be hidden somewhere. "I made coffee," I said without looking up from my book. "There's bread for toast and cereal in the pantry, but you always make breakfast on Saturdays." "I made breakfast for myself," I replied calmly. "I assumed you could handle making your own." He stood there for several moments, clearly unsure how to respond to this deviation from our established routine. Finally, he opened a pantry and began rummaging around for cereal, muttering under his breath about how strange I had been acting lately. Sophia emerged from her room around noon, also expecting to find food prepared for her consumption. When she discovered that no one had cooked anything special for the weekend, she complained loudly about how weird our house had become. "Why isn't there any real food?" she asked, as if someone had removed all edible items from our kitchen. "There's plenty of food," I said. "You just have to prepare it yourself, but I don't know how to cook anything complicated." "Then learn something simple, or eat something that doesn't require cooking." She stared at me with the expression of someone who had been asked to perform an impossible task. "Mom, you're being really strange lately. Why are you acting like this?" "I'm not acting like anything," I replied. "I'm just not automatically serving everyone else anymore. This is what it looks like when you have to take care of yourself." These small rebellions might have seemed petty to an outside observer, but they felt significant to me. Each time I chose not to automatically meet someone else's unstated expectations, I was reclaiming a small piece of my own agency. Each time I prioritized my own preferences over someone else's convenience, I was remembering that I was a person with legitimate needs and desires. The changes didn't go unnoticed by my family, but their responses revealed just how little they understood about the scope of what I had been doing for them. Marcus seemed to think I was going through some kind of temporary phase that would resolve itself if he waited patiently. Sophia appeared to believe that I was deliberately making her life difficult out of some inexplicable desire to be mean. Neither of them considered the possibility that I might have legitimate reasons for changing my behavior. Neither of them asked what I needed or wanted from our relationship. Their primary concern was how my changes affected their comfort and convenience. This reaction confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My family saw me primarily as a service provider, rather than as a person with my own inner life and legitimate needs. When the service became less reliable, they were annoyed and confused, but they didn't question whether they had been taking that service for granted. I started documenting these interactions in a small notebook, not out of any desire for revenge, but because I wanted to maintain clarity about what was actually happening in our relationships. It was too easy to second-guess myself, to wonder if I was being unreasonable or overly sensitive. Writing down specific conversations and incidents helped me see patterns that might have been invisible otherwise. The notebook revealed some troubling trends. Marcus had not asked me a single question about my own interests, feelings, or experiences in his conversations with me were entirely focused on logistics: what was for dinner, whether his shirts were clean, when various bills needed to be paid. He spoke to me like I was an employee whose personal life was irrelevant to our professional relationship. Sophia's interactions with me were even more limited. She communicated primarily through requests and complaints. She wanted rides to friends' houses, money for various activities, help finding things she had misplaced. When those requests weren't immediately fulfilled, she became frustrated and accused me of not caring about her needs. She seemed to have no awareness that I might have needs of my own. Reading through my notebook entries, I realized that I had essentially been living with two people who saw me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be known and appreciated. The insight was painful but clarifying. I couldn't change how they saw me, but I could change how I responded to their treatment. I began making more dramatic changes to our household routines. Instead of grocery shopping based entirely on everyone else's preferences, I bought foods that I enjoyed eating. If Marcus wanted specific brands or items, he could add them to the list or shop for them himself. If Sophia needed supplies for school projects, she could plan ahead and purchase them herself or ask for help in advance, rather than expecting me to drop everything for last-minute shopping trips. I stopped managing their social calendars. If Marcus wanted to accept dinner invitations or plan social events, he could handle the logistics himself. If Sophia wanted to attend parties or social gatherings, she could arrange her own transportation rather than assuming I would be available as her personal driver. Most significantly, I stopped feeling responsible for their emotional comfort. When Marcus came home stressed from work, I listened if he wanted to talk, but I didn't automatically try to solve his problems or improve his mood. When Sophia was frustrated with friends or schoolwork, I offered support if she asked for it, but I didn't take on her emotional burdens as my own responsibility. These changes created noticeable tension in our household. Marcus and Sophia seemed to be constantly frustrated by my failure to anticipate their needs and smooth over their difficulties. They complained frequently about how selfish I had become, as if my previous pattern of self-sacrifice had been the normal and healthy dynamic they deserved to maintain. The irony was overwhelming. I had spent decades prioritizing everyone else's needs over my own, and now that I was beginning to consider my own preferences, I was being accused of selfishness. The accusation revealed just how entitled they had become to my unpaid labor and emotional support. I started spending more time away from home, enrolling in additional classes and activities that interested me. Besides pottery, I joined a book club at the library and signed up for watercolor painting lessons at the community college. These activities gave me social connections outside my family and reminded me that I was capable of learning new skills and forming friendships based on shared interests, rather than service provision. The women I met in these settings treated me like a complete person with valuable opinions and interesting experiences. They asked about my thoughts on books, complimented my artistic attempts, and shared their own stories of personal growth and discovery. These interactions reminded me what it felt like to be seen and appreciated for who I was, rather than what I could do for others. Carol from pottery class became a particularly important friend. She had navigated her own transition from invisible wife to independent woman, and she understood the complex emotions involved in reclaiming your own life after years of self-sacrifice. The hardest part, Carol told me one evening after class, is that they'll try to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself. They've gotten used to you being invisible, and they don't understand why you suddenly want to be seen. Her words resonated deeply with me. Marcus and Sophia weren't necessarily bad people, but they had become accustomed to a relationship dynamic where my needs were invisible and their needs were paramount. Changing that dynamic required me to disappoint them repeatedly as I established new boundaries and priorities. The guilt was significant. I had been trained by decades of social conditioning to believe that good wives and mothers always put their families first. Choosing myself felt selfish and wrong, even when I could see intellectually that the previous arrangement had been unsustainable and unfair. But each time I honored my own preferences over someone else's convenience, each time I chose my own interests over their expectations, I felt a little stronger and more confident in my own worth. I was rediscovering who I was beneath all the service and sacrifice, and that person was more interesting and capable than I had remembered. Margaret Chen called me a few weeks after I had signed the new documents. "Mrs. Patterson, I wanted to follow up on your estate planning changes. How are you feeling about the decisions you made?" "I feel good about them," I said honestly. "For the first time in years, my legal documents actually reflect my values and priorities." "That's wonderful to hear. I also wanted to remind you that these changes are completely confidential. The beneficiary designations on your insurance and retirement accounts won't be disclosed to anyone unless you choose to share that information." I hadn't really considered the privacy aspect of my changes. Marcus and Sophia had no way of knowing that they were no longer my primary beneficiaries unless I told them. They were operating under the assumption that our previous arrangements were still in place, which meant they had no reason to change their behavior based on financial consideration. This realization gave me a strange sense of power. For the first time in our marriage, I knew something significant that Marcus didn't know. I was making decisions that would affect our family's future without consulting him or seeking his approval. The secrecy felt both thrilling and slightly terrifying. As spring progressed into early summer, my new routines became more established. I was cooking simpler meals and eating them alone without feeling sad or rejected. I was managing only my own schedule and responsibilities, leaving Marcus and Sophia to handle their own logistics. I was spending money on classes and activities that brought me pleasure rather than automatically budgeting every dollar for household expenses and family needs. The financial freedom was particularly significant. For years I had been so focused on saving money and managing household expenses efficiently that I had forgotten I was entitled to spend some of our income on my own interests and enjoyment. Marcus had never questioned my household spending decisions, but I had internalized such strict budget consciousness that I rarely bought anything for myself that wasn't absolutely necessary. Now I was purchasing art supplies, paying for classes, buying books and small luxuries that made my daily life more enjoyable. The amounts weren't large, but the psychological impact was significant. I was finally treating myself like a person whose happiness mattered, rather than like a household manager whose personal needs were secondary to operational efficiency. Marcus noticed the changes in our household budget, primarily because he had to start paying for services I had previously provided. When he needed shirts pressed for important meetings, he had to take them to the dry clean. When he wanted elaborate meals, he had to either cook them himself or order takeout. When he needed personal items from the store, he had to make special trips rather than adding them to my regular shopping list. "Helen, our household expenses have increased significantly lately," he said one evening, reviewing our monthly bank statements. "What's going on with our spending? I'm not managing every detail of everyone else's life anymore," I replied. "You and Sophia are paying for services and conveniences that I use to provide for free, but those services are expensive. The dry cleaning alone is costing us hundreds of dollars a month. Then you might want to learn to iron your own shirt." He looked at me as if I had suggested something completely unreasonable. "Helen, I don't have time to iron shirts. I'm running a business, and I don't have time to be your personal laundry service. I have my own interests and activities now." The conversation revealed the economic reality of unpaid domestic labor. When Marcus had to purchase services that I had been providing for free, the actual cost of my work became visible. The dry cleaning, takeout meals and hired help that were replacing my labor represented thousands of dollars per year in value that I had been contributing to our household without recognition or compensation. This economic revelation was both validating and infuriating. Validating because it confirmed that my work had significant financial value that had been invisible as long as I provided it for free. Infuriating because it showed how much my family had been taking for granted, without ever acknowledging the economic contribution I was making to our standard of living. I started calculating the replacement cost of all my household labor: cooking, cleaning, laundry, shopping, organizing, calendar management, social coordination, and emotional support. The numbers were staggering. If Marcus had to hire people to provide all the services I had been giving him for free, it would cost him well over $50,000 per year. Yet he had never thought of my work as economically valuable, because it wasn't monetized. He could see the value of his accounting services because clients paid him directly for his time and expertise. But my time and expertise in managing our household had been invisible to him because no money changed hands. This invisibility was one of the reasons I felt so confident about my beneficiary changes. I was ensuring that my actual economic contributions would be recognized after my death by directing my assets toward organizations that valued the kind of work I had been doing. Rather than simply transferring my wealth to people who had taken my labor for granted, I was supporting institutions that understood the importance of domestic work and women's contributions to society. The summer progressed with increasing tension in our household. Marcus and Sophia had adapted somewhat to my reduced availability, but they clearly resented having to handle more of their own responsibilities. Their complaints became more frequent and more pointed. "Mom, you've changed completely," Sophia said one evening when I declined to drive her to a friend's house. You used to care about what I needed. I still care about you, I replied calmly. But caring about you doesn't mean I have to drop everything to provide transportation services whenever you want them. You can call a rideshare, ask your friend to pick you up, or plan ahead and arrange something yourself. But that costs money and takes planning. Yes, it does. Those are normal parts of managing your own life. Marcus's complaints were more sophisticated but equally revealing. He framed his objections in terms of our marriage and family harmony rather than his personal convenience. But the underlying message was the same. He wanted me to return to my previous pattern of invisible service. Helen, I feel like we're becoming strangers, he said one evening. We used to work as a team. Now it feels like you're prioritizing everything else over our relationship. When did we work as a team? I asked. Can you give me a specific example of when you considered my needs and preferences in your decision-making? Another long pause as he searched his memory. I've always considered your needs. That's why I work so hard to provide for our family. Providing financially is important, but it's not the same as considering my needs as a person. When was the last time you asked what I wanted for dinner? When was the last time you planned an activity based on my interests? When was the last time you did something specifically to make my life easier or more enjoyable? The questions hung in the air between us, unanswered because there were no good answers. Marcus had been an excellent provider and a reliable husband, but he had stopped being a considerate partner years ago. He had fallen into the comfortable assumption that providing financial security was sufficient contribution to our marriage, leaving all the emotional labor and daily care work to me. I realized that evening that our marriage had become a business arrangement, where I provided domestic and emotional services in exchange for financial support. The arrangement had worked for Marcus because he received comprehensive life management services, without having to reciprocate emotional attention or domestic labor. It had worked for me only as long as I didn't expect to be seen and valued as a complete person with my own needs and interests. Now that I was no longer willing to be invisible, the fundamental inequality of our arrangement was becoming apparent to both of us. Marcus wanted to return to the previous dynamic because it had served his needs so well. I was no longer willing to accept invisibility as the price of financial security. The conversation marked another turning point in my personal evolution. I finally understood that I wasn't trying to fix our marriage or improve our family dynamic. I was trying to reclaim my own life and identity after years of self-erasure. Whether Marcus and Sophia could adapt to having a relationship with me as a complete person remained to be seen, but I was no longer willing to disappear for their comfort. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the beneficiary documents locked in Margaret Chen's office safe. My family had no idea that their financial future had already changed to reflect my new priorities and values. They were still operating under the assumption that they could take my contributions for granted, while expecting to benefit from my life's work after my death. The secret knowledge felt like having a trump card in a game where the other players didn't even realize we were playing. They could continue treating me like an invisible service provider, but they would eventually discover that invisible people don't leave visible legacies to those who failed to see them. I wasn't planning to die anytime soon, but knowing that my final statement would reflect my actual values, rather than their assumptions, gave me a sense of completion and control that I hadn't felt in decades. For the first time since our marriage began, I was authoring my own story rather than serving as a supporting character in someone else's narrative. The summer heat was building, but I felt cooler and calmer than I had in years. I was finally becoming visible to myself, and that was turning out to be much more important than being visible to anyone else. The opportunity I had been unconsciously waiting for arrived on a sweltering Tuesday in late July. Marcus came home from work visibly excited, practically bouncing through the front door with news that would change everything. His accounting firm had been selected to handle the books for 3 major construction companies, expanding into our region. The contracts would nearly double his annual income and establish his practice as one of the most successful in the state. "Helen, this is it," he said, loosening his tie as he paced around the kitchen. "This is what we've been working toward for 25 years. I'll need to hire 4 new staff members, maybe lease additional office space. We're talking about serious money here." I congratulated him sincerely,
genuinely pleased that his hard work was being rewarded. Marcus had always been ambitious and dedicated to his business, and this success represented years of careful networking and professional development. He deserved recognition for his accomplishments. I want to celebrate, he continued, his enthusiasm infectious. Let's plan something special. Maybe that European trip we've talked about, or we could look at vacation homes. With this kind of income, we can finally afford the lifestyle we've always wanted. I noticed his language carefully, the lifestyle we've always wanted. He was making assumptions about shared dreams and mutual priorities, without actually consulting me about what I might want our future to look like. After months of reclaiming my own voice and preferences, his automatic presumption that I would simply go along with his vision felt particularly jarring. What kind of celebration did you have in mind? I asked carefully. I was thinking we could host a dinner party this weekend. Invite the partners from the firm, maybe some of the new clients. You could make that amazing prime rib roast with all the sides. Really show them how well we're doing. There it was. His first instinct for celebrating his professional success was to put me to work creating an impressive display for his colleagues. Not a romantic dinner for the two of us, not a fun family activity, but an elaborate entertaining opportunity, where I would provide unpaid catering services to advance his business relationships. Marcus, that sounds like a lot of work for me. Why don't we hire a catering company, if you want to impress your business associates? He looked genuinely surprised by my suggestion. Helen, you're an amazing cook. Everyone always raves about your dinner party. Besides, catering would be expensive, and it's more personal when you do it yourself. More personal for whom, I wondered. More personal for Marcus, who would receive credit for having a wife capable of producing restaurant-quality meals for his professional benefit. The personal element he valued was my unpaid labor, not my presence, as an equal partner in his celebration. I appreciate the compliment, but I'm not interested in spending my weekend cooking for your business associates, I said calmly. If you want to celebrate your success, we should do something that we can both enjoy. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Marcus's assumptions about our relationship dynamic. He couldn't understand why I wasn't automatically excited to help him celebrate by providing domestic services for his benefit. In his mind, his professional success was our success, and my role was to support his achievements by managing the social and domestic aspects of his career advancement. Helen, I don't understand your attitude lately, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. This expansion is going to benefit our whole family. We'll finally have the financial security to do all the things we've talked about. What things have we talked about? I asked. Can you give me specific examples of plans we've made together based on my interests and preferences? Another long pause as he searched for examples that didn't exist. Well, you've always wanted to travel. You've talked about seeing Europe, visiting gardens in England. When did I talk about that? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I had mentioned those dreams years ago, before I learned that sharing my interests with Marcus was pointless, because he never remembered or referenced them in his planning. I thought you wanted those things, he said uncertainly. I did want them, but you never followed up or included them in any actual plans. You're assuming I still have the same dreams I mentioned 15 years ago because you've never bothered to ask what I want now. The conversation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for both of us. Marcus was discovering that he knew very little about my current interests or desires because he had stopped asking about them years ago. I was realizing that even his gesture of sharing his success with me was primarily about how I could serve his celebration, rather than how we might celebrate together. That evening I made a decision that would accelerate everything. Instead of arguing further about the dinner party, I agreed to host it. Not because I wanted to return to my previous pattern of invisible domestic labor, but because I wanted to demonstrate something important to Marcus and his colleagues.
All right. I'll host your dinner party, but I'm going to do it my way. Marcus looked relieved and pleased. That's wonderful, Helen. I knew you'd understand how important this is. He had no idea what he had just agreed to. I spent the rest of the week planning what would become the most memorable dinner party of Marcus's career, though not for the reasons he expected. I sent elegant invitations to 6 couples, including the senior partners at his firm and the executives from his new major clients. I hired a cleaning service to prepare the house and ordered flowers for every room. I purchased the finest ingredients for an elaborate multi-course meal that would showcase sophisticated culinary skills. Everything appeared to be proceeding exactly as Marcus had hoped. He complimented my preparations, expressed appreciation for the effort I was putting into his celebration, and looked forward to impressing his guests with our hospitality and success. What Marcus didn't know was that I had also made other preparations. I had asked Margaret Chen to prepare a second set of documents that I could reference during the evening. I had written a brief speech that I planned to deliver over dessert, and I had invited one additional guest whom Marcus wasn't expecting. Carol from my pottery class had become a close friend over the months, and she understood exactly what I was planning to accomplish. She also happened to be a retired social worker who had spent her career helping women navigate difficult life transitions. Her presence would serve multiple purposes during the evening. Saturday evening arrived with perfect summer weather. Our house looked beautiful, filled with fresh flowers and elegant table setting. I had prepared a menu that would have impressed the food critics: herb-crusted rack of lamb, roasted vegetables with truffle oil, artisanal bread, and a chocolate soufflé that required precise timing and considerable skill. The guests arrived promptly at 7, dressed in their finest business attire and clearly expecting an evening of good food, wine, and networking opportunity. Marcus moved through the group like the successful host he had always wanted to be, accepting congratulations on his business expansion and basking in the admiration of his colleagues. I played my expected role perfectly for the first 2 hours. I served cocktails and appetizers, made pleasant conversation about food and travel, and ensured that everyone felt welcome and well fed. The lamb was perfectly cooked, the wine selections were excellent, and the atmosphere was sophisticated and warm. Marcus was glowing with pride and satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of evening he had envisioned, where his professional success was enhanced by his wife's domestic capabilities and social skills. His guests complimented him repeatedly on the meal, the hospitality, and his obvious good fortune in having such an accomplished partner. As I served the chocolate soufflé and coffee, I caught Marcus's eye and smiled. He smiled back, clearly pleased with how the evening was progressing. That was when I stood up at the head of the table and cleared my throat gently. Before everyone leaves this evening, I wanted to share something important with all of you, I began, my voice calm and clear. Marcus has been celebrating his business success, and I think it's wonderful when hard work is rewarded. But I realized tonight that there's something else we should celebrate. The guests settled into attentive silence, expecting perhaps a toast to Marcus's achievements, or an announcement about our future plan. We should celebrate the end of my 25-year career as an unpaid domestic employee, I continued, watching as confused glances were exchanged around the table. This dinner party represents thousands of dollars worth of cooking, shopping, cleaning, organizing, and social coordination that I have provided without compensation throughout our marriage. Marcus's face had gone pale, and he was gesturing subtly for me to sit down and stop talking. But I had spent months preparing for this moment, and I wasn't going to be silenced by his discomfort. I calculated the replacement cost of my household labor recently, I said, pulling out a folder that Margaret had helped me prepare. Between cooking, cleaning, laundry, organizing, calendar management, social coordination, and emotional support, I have been providing approximately $60,000 worth of services annually. Over 25 years, that represents $1.5 million in unpaid labor. The silence around the table was complete. Even the couples who had been whispering among themselves had stopped talking entirely. Marcus never valued this work because he never had to pay for it, I continued. But now that I've stopped providing these services automatically, he's discovering what they actually cost. The dry cleaning alone is running him several $100s per month. I could see Marcus calculating desperately, trying to figure out how to stop me from continuing without creating an even bigger scene. But I had planned this moment carefully, and I wasn't finished. The interesting thing about invisible labor, I said, is that it only becomes visible when it disappears. For months now, I've been reducing my domestic services, and the replacement costs have been quite eye-opening for our household budget. Carol, who had been listening intently from her seat near the end of the table, spoke up for the first time. Helen, You mentioned that you made some other changes recently. Would you like to share those with the group? This was the moment I had been building toward for months. I reached into the folder and pulled out copies of my beneficiary change documents, the same papers I had signed in Margaret's office earlier that summer. I also changed all my beneficiary designations, I said matter of fact. My life insurance, retirement accounts, and will have been updated to reflect my actual values and priorities. Marcus's face went from pale to gray. Helen, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that people who don't value my contributions during my life shouldn't expect to benefit from my death, I replied calmly. My assets will now support organizations that actually help women transition out of invisible domestic servitude. I handed copies of the documents to several guests, including Marcus's business partners. As you can see, the bulk of my estate will now go to women's shelters, scholarship funds for older women returning to school, and financial counseling services for people leaving difficult marriages. The dinner party had shifted from celebration to revelation, and the guests were clearly struggling to process what they were witnessing. Some looked horrified by the public nature of my announcement. Others seemed fascinated by the financial documentation I was sharing. A few of the women were nodding slowly, as if recognizing elements of their own experiences in my description. Marcus finally found his voice. Helen, this is completely inappropriate. These are private family matters. They were private when they were working in your favor, I replied. But you made them public when you invited your colleagues to witness the fruits of my unpaid labor. I thought they should understand the full cost of the hospitality they're enjoying. Dr. Patricia Williams, one of Marcus's new clients, leaned forward with interest. Miss Patterson, are you saying that your husband never compensated you for household management? That's exactly what I'm saying, I replied. For 25 years I provided comprehensive domestic and emotional services without salary, benefits, vacation time or recognition. The work was invisible because it was unpaid, but it was essential to maintaining the lifestyle and professional image that Marcus has built his career upon. Marcus stood up abruptly. Helen, I think you've made your point. Perhaps we should let our guests enjoy their dessert in peace. I think our guests are intelligent enough to handle a conversation about economic reality, I said, remaining seated. After all, these are successful business people. They understand the value of professional services. James Hartley, one of Marcus's senior partners, cleared his throat carefully. Mrs. Patterson, are you saying that you're seeking some kind of retroactive compensation for household work? I'm saying that I've stopped providing uncompensated services, and I've ensured that my assets will support women who are still trapped in similar situations, I replied. I'm not seeking anything from Marcus except acknowledgement that my contributions had value. The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had ever happened in our dining room. The guests began discussing the economic implications of unpaid domestic labor, sharing their own experiences with household management, and questioning assumptions about marriage roles that many of them had never examined. Dr. Williams, who was clearly the most successful woman at the table, spoke about her own struggles to balance career advancement with social expectations about domestic responsibility. I hire housekeeping and meal services because I recognized early that I couldn't maintain my practice and provide comprehensive domestic labor, but many women don't have that choice. Her husband, who ran a successful investment firm, looked uncomfortable as the conversation continued. Patricia handles most of the household coordination, even though she works 60 hours a week at the hospital. I never really thought about the time and effort involved. Around the table, similar admissions emerged. The women shared stories of invisible labor and unacknowledged contribution. The men seemed to be discovering for the first time that their comfortable domestic lives required substantial work that they had never noticed or valued. Marcus sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence, as his celebration dinner became a consciousness-raising session about unpaid women's work. Every few minutes, he would try to redirect the conversation back to his business success, but the guests seemed more interested in discussing the economic revelations I had introduced. Carol, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the evening, finally spoke up again. Helen, I think what you've done tonight takes tremendous courage. Most women never find a way to make their invisible work visible. It's not courageous, I replied. It's just honest. I spent decades hiding the cost of maintaining Marcus's comfortable life, because I thought that was what good wives were supposed to do. But invisibility isn't kindness. It's just another form of dishonesty. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, the responses were mixed, but telling. Several of the women asked for my contact information, saying they wanted to continue the conversation about domestic labor and marriage dynamics. A couple of the men looked thoughtful and somewhat uncomfortable, as if they were reconsidering their own household arrangements. Marcus's business partners were professional enough to maintain cordial farewells, but I could see them processing the implications of what they had witnessed. Their successful colleague's wife had just publicly documented his dependence on her unpaid labor and announced that she was no longer willing to provide those services automatically. After the last guest left, Marcus and I stood in our kitchen surrounded by the detritus of what had been intended as his triumph celebration. Dirty dishes, empty wine glasses, and the lingering scent of success that had been transformed into something much more complex. "Helen, I can't believe you did that," Marcus said finally. "You humiliated me in front of my most important business contacts." "I didn't humiliate you," I replied, beginning to load the dishwasher. "I told the truth about our relationship dynamic. If the truth is humiliating, maybe you should consider why that might be. Those documents you showed everyone, are they real? Did you actually change your beneficiaries?" "Completely real," I said calmly. "Signed, filed, and legally binding." Marcus sat down heavily at the kitchen counter, suddenly looking older than his 54 years. "Helen, I don't understand what I did wrong. I've always provided for this family. I've never cheated or gambled or done anything to hurt you." "You didn't do anything wrong," I said, which seemed to surprise him. "But you also didn't do anything right. You stopped seeing me as a person with my own needs and dreams. You started treating me like a household appliance that required minimal maintenance, but provided essential services. I never treated you like an appliance. When was the last time you asked me what I wanted for my birthday? When was the last time you planned an activity based on my interests? When was the last time you thanked me for cooking dinner or managing your social calendar?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. "I thought you were happy," he said quietly. "You never complained. You seemed to enjoy taking care of the house and managing everything." "I never complained because I thought that was what good wives were supposed to do. I thought if I just tried harder and loved more generously, you would eventually notice and appreciate my contributions." "I did appreciate them. I do appreciate them. Appreciation isn't the same as acknowledgement. You appreciated the results of my work, but you never acknowledged the work itself or the person doing it." Marcus picked up one of the beneficiary documents I had left on the counter, reading through the legal language with his accountant's eye for detail. "Helen, these changes mean that Sophia and I would receive almost nothing if something happened to you. You would receive the house and enough money to maintain it comfortably. Sophia would receive an inheritance when she turns 25, along with a letter explaining why the amount is modest. But yes, the bulk of my assets will support women who are trying to escape invisible domestic servitude. But we're your family. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Being family should mean treating each other with respect and consideration. It should mean acknowledging each other's contributions and caring about each other's happiness. For years I've been the only one in this family operating by those principles." The conversation continued for several more hours, with Marcus alternating between hurt confusion and frustrated anger. He genuinely seemed to believe that providing financial support entitled him to comprehensive domestic services, without reciprocal consideration or appreciation. The idea that I might have legitimate grievances about our relationship dynamics was completely foreign to his understanding of marriage. I went to bed that night feeling lighter than I had in years. The secret was finally out. My family and Marcus's professional circle now knew that I was no longer willing to be invisible. The beneficiary changes that had felt so revolutionary when I made them privately were now public knowledge, which meant I could no longer be taken for granted based on assumptions about my future compliance. Over the next few weeks, the aftermath of the dinner party continued to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Williams called to invite me to lunch, saying that our conversation had prompted her to reevaluate her own household arrangement. 2 other women from the party reached out with similar requests, wanting to discuss their own experiences with invisible domestic labor. Marcus's business partners treated him with professional courtesy, but I could sense a shift in their social interaction. They now understood that his comfortable lifestyle and successful professional image had been subsidized by his wife's unpaid labor, and that subsidy was ending. Several of them began hiring household services that their wives had been providing for free, which created interesting discussions in their own marriages. The most significant change was in my relationship with Sophia. My 18-year-old daughter had been largely absent during the dinner party, spending the evening at a friend's house as she usually did when we entertained Marcus's colleague. But news of what had happened reached her through our social network, and she came home the next week with questions and accusations. "Mom, everyone's talking about how you embarrassed Dad in front of his work friends," she said, confronting me in the kitchen where so many of our family dramas had played out over the years. "I told the truth about our family dynamics," I replied. "If the truth was embarrassing, that says something important about those dynamics, but why did you have to do it in public? Why couldn't you talk to Dad privately? I tried talking to your father privately for months. He didn't hear me until I made my concerns visible to other people." Sophia sat down at the kitchen counter, looking more thoughtful than angry. "Is it true that you changed your will, that I won't inherit anything when you die? You'll inherit a modest amount when you turn 25, but most of my assets will support organizations that help women who are struggling to find their own voices and independence. But I'm your daughter. Don't you want to take care of me? I've been taking care of you for 18 years, now I want to help you learn to take care of yourself." The conversation revealed how much Sophia had absorbed our family's dysfunctional dynamics without recognizing them. She had grown up watching her father treat me like a service provider rather than a partner, and she had learned to expect similar service from me, without offering reciprocal consideration or appreciation. But she was also 18 years old and smart enough to recognize patterns when they were pointed out clearly. Over the course of our conversation, she began to understand how her own treatment of me had mirrored her father's assumptions and entitlement. "Mom, I never realized how much you do for us," she said finally. "I guess I thought that was just what mothers did automatically." "Some of it is what mothers do," I replied, "but some of it was me, trying to buy love and appreciation through service. That wasn't healthy for any of us." "Are you and Dad going to get divorced?" The question hung in the air between us. I had been wondering the same thing for months, but I wasn't ready to make that announcement yet. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Your father and I are trying to figure out if we can build a different kind of relationship, based on mutual respect and consideration. If we can't, then we'll need to make other decisions." The summer ended with our household in a state of suspended transition. Marcus was making efforts to be more appreciative and considerate, but his attempts often felt forced and temporary. He would thank me for cooking dinner with obvious deliberation, as if checking an item off a list rather than expressing genuine gratitude. He would ask about my pottery class with the careful attention of someone trying to demonstrate interest in subjects that bored him. I appreciated his efforts, but I could see that he was performing consideration rather than feeling it. He was trying to return our relationship to its previous comfortable state by adding a thin layer of acknowledgement over the same fundamental dynamic. He still expected me to manage most domestic responsibilities. He just wanted to remember to say thank you occasionally. Sophia was making more genuine progress. She started doing her own laundry without being reminded, began cleaning up after herself in common areas, and even cooked dinner for the family one evening. Her efforts felt more authentic because she was learning new skills rather than trying to modify old assumptions. By September, I had reached a decision about my marriage that felt both inevitable and liberating. Marcus and I had been trying for months to build a more equitable partnership, but his efforts were consistently undermined by his fundamental belief that marriage entitled him to domestic services in exchange for financial support. He couldn't imagine a relationship where we were truly equal partners rather than complementary service providers. I made an appointment with Margaret Chen to discuss divorce proceedings, not because I was angry or seeking revenge, but because I had finally accepted that I couldn't create a meaningful partnership with someone who didn't see me as a complete person worthy of genuine consideration. "Are you certain about this decision?"
Margaret asked as we reviewed the legal implications of ending my marriage. I'm certain that I want to spend the rest of my life in relationships where I'm valued for who I am rather than what I can do for other people, I replied. Marcus is a good man in many ways, but he's not capable of seeing me as an equal partner. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward. Marcus was more hurt than angry, and he didn't contest my decision or try to change the beneficiary designations I had already made. He seemed to understand, finally, that he had lost something irreplaceable, even if he couldn't fully comprehend what that something had been. I moved into a small apartment near the community college where I had been taking class. The space was entirely mine, decorated according to my preferences, organized around my routines and interests. For the first time in 25 years, I was living according to my own priorities rather than serving as support staff for someone else's life. The financial settlement provided me with enough resources to live comfortably while pursuing interests and activities that brought me genuine pleasure. I enrolled in additional classes, traveled to places I had always wanted to see, and developed friendships based on shared interests rather than service provision. Marcus adapted to single life by hiring household services to replace the labor I had been providing for free. He seemed to be learning gradually to value work that he had to pay for in ways that he had never valued the same work when I provided it without compensation. Sophia thrived at college, where she was surrounded by other young women who were learning to manage their own lives without relying on invisible domestic labor from their mother. She called regularly to share her experiences and ask for advice, treating me like a person whose opinions and insights had value rather than a service provider whose primary function was solving her immediate problems. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I received a call from Dr. Williams. She had been working with a local women's shelter to develop financial literacy programs for women leaving difficult marriages, and she wanted to know if I would be interested in volunteering to help other women navigate the legal and economic aspects of divorce. You showed us all something important that night at your dinner party, she said. You demonstrated that it's possible to make invisible work visible and to demand acknowledgement for contributions that have been taken for granted. A lot of women could benefit from learning how you did that. I accepted her invitation and began volunteering at the shelter, helping women understand their legal rights and economic options when leaving marriages where their contributions had been undervalued or invisible. The work was deeply satisfying because it allowed me to use the insights I had gained from my own experience to help other women reclaim their voices and independence. 1 year after the dinner party that changed everything, I hosted another gathering. This time the guests were women from my pottery class, the book club, my volunteer work, and my new life as an independent person. We ate simple food that we prepared together, sharing stories and laughter in the small apartment that reflected my own tastes and priority. Carol raised her glass of wine toward the end of the evening. To Helen, who showed us all that it's never too late to become visible to yourself, I looked around the table at these women who saw me as a complete person worthy of friendship and respect. Their appreciation wasn't based on what I could do for them, but on who I was as an individual with my own thoughts, experiences, and contributions to our shared conversations. To all of us, I replied, for learning that we don't have to disappear to make other people comfortable. The toast felt like a benediction on the long journey I had taken from invisible service provider to visible human being. The beneficiary changes that had started as a private act of rebellion had become the foundation for an entirely new life, built around authentic relationships and genuine appreciation. Marcus and I maintained a cordial relationship focused primarily on co-parenting Sophia and managing the practical details of our divorced life. He seemed to be learning to value the household services he now had to purchase, and he occasionally expressed regret about taking my contributions for granted during our marriage. But those regrets felt more like intellectual understanding than emotional recognition, and I was grateful to no longer need his approval or appreciation to feel valuable. Sophia was thriving in her independent life, developing skills and confidence that she might never have gained if I had continued providing comprehensive support services without encouraging her self-reliance. She often thanked me for teaching her to value her own capabilities, rather than depending on other people's labor to maintain her comfort. My life insurance and retirement accounts remained designated for organizations that supported women's independence and recognition of domestic labor's economic value. But now those designations felt less like a posthumous statement and more like an ongoing commitment to supporting work that aligned with my actual values and experience. The small apartment where I had rebuilt my life was filled with pottery I had made in my classes, paintings I had created in my art groups, and books I had chosen based on my own interests rather than anyone else's expectation. Every object in my space reflected choices I had made for my own pleasure and satisfaction. On quiet evenings, I would sit on my small balcony watching the sunset over the city, drinking tea from cups I had shaped with my own hands. The view was modest compared to the suburban home I had left behind, but it was entirely mine. No one expected me to cook elaborate meals, manage complex schedules, or disappear my own needs for their comfort. The transformation from invisible wife to visible woman had taken nearly 2 years of gradual awakening, careful planning, and courageous action. The dinner party had been the public revelation of changes that had been building privately for months. The beneficiary modifications had been both practical planning and symbolic statement about whose contributions deserved recognition and reward. Looking back, I realized that the most important change hadn't been in my legal documents or living situation. The most important change had been in how I saw myself. I had rediscovered that I was a person worthy of consideration, appreciation, and genuine relationship rather than a household appliance that required minimal maintenance while providing essential services. The women I helped at the shelter often asked how I had found the courage to change my life so dramatically. I told them that courage hadn't been required for the big dramatic gestures like the dinner party or filing for divorce. Courage had been required for the small daily choices to honor my own preferences over someone else's convenience, to prioritize my own interests over other people's expectations, to remember that I was a person whose happiness mattered. The beneficiary changes that had felt so revolutionary when I first signed them now seemed like simple common sense. Why would I leave my assets to people who had never valued my contributions during my life? Why would I reward indifference and entitlement with posthumous financial benefit? My money would do much more good, supporting organizations that understood the value of work like mine, than subsidizing the continued comfort of people who had learned to take such work for granted. As the second anniversary of my awakening approached, I reflected on how different my life had become from the invisible domestic servitude that had defined my previous existence. I was finally living according to my own values and priorities, surrounded by people who appreciated me for who I was, rather than what I could do for them. The house where I had eaten dinner alone while my family watched television in other rooms felt like a memory from someone else's life. The woman who had vacuumed under beds and ironed shirts and managed everyone else's needs, while forgetting her own preferences, seemed like a character from a story I had read long ago. I was still that woman in many ways, but now I was also visible to myself. I had learned to value my own contributions, demand acknowledgement for my work, and prioritize my happiness alongside everyone else's comfort. The transformation had been gradual and sometimes painful, but it had led to a life that finally reflected my actual worth, rather than my willingness to disappear for other people's convenience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.